was once a Christian. I was once a Catholic Christian. Grew up in a Catholic home, went to Mass, participated in religious activities. But one of the things that we came across on churches, or what we were taught or preached to, or were made to learn mostly, are things that are anti-indigenous systems. When we talk about Igbo, it's anti-Igbo, especially in regards to how we interact with the divine, which is our ancestors. Every Igbo child, every African child fears his or her late ancestor, because a child could have an apparition of an ancestor and an adult would tell that child to reject and to pray against such apparitions. Now, if that same child has an apparition of a white figure in his or her dreams, that child would be applauded, because they would automatically tell that child that, oh, you saw God's angel. God's angel came and showed you something, which means you have been a good child. But who says that white is good and black is evil? It is because there are fundamental questions Africans have refused to ask. And this fundamental question is, who decides these things? Who decides which religious practice or which religious belief is real, and who decides whether the other practice or belief is an illusion? So who decides these things? Who decides what is morally wrong and who decides what is morally right? Who decides these things? Who decides that I shouldn't venerate my ancestors because that means I'm communicating with the dead, and that is a sin? And who decides that when in a Catholic institution I pray with the rosary, the litany of the saints, when I call upon the saints, Saint Mary, Saint Hugh, Saint whatever, come and pray and intercede for me, who decides that when I call on saints, it is right, but when I call on Okeke, Oka for my ancestors, it is wrong? Who decides these things? Who decides which religion is primitive and who decides which religion is sophisticated, especially in religious structures? Because the churches, they have their basilica, they have their beautiful altars and their sacraments. But in our traditional indigenous belief systems, we have our oposi, our sticks, our stones that we crafted as a representation of who we are, as a representation of how we see and how we view the world. So who decides that these basilicas are right and who decides that these ones are wrong and it's demonic? Now, what are the symbolic meanings behind each of those systems, especially in relative to indigenous people? What does these things represent to us? Who then decides that what these people did is wrong and what these people did is bad? Let me rephrase. Who decides that what these people did is right and who decides that what these people did is wrong? Who decides these things? Who decides that the ornaments, our way of worship, our mode of worship is wrong, and who decides that their own way of worship and their own mode of worship is right? Who decides these things? Now, finally, I've come to the conclusion that every religious and cultural belief system is simply an indigenous way of seeing and understanding the world, the divine. And all those things are in tune with our day-to-day activities, our day-to-day realities. Our African ancestors saw the divinity within nature and they decided to venerate God through nature. That's what our understanding is. Now, the white man and their own way of seeing and interpreting the divine differs from us. And each of these systems in their own way is right. When a white person When a Caucasian or a Caucasoid, when they worship God in the churches, they are right. It is their tradition. It is their history. It is their culture. When an African man decides to demonize his own ancestors and their own way of seeing the divine, God, and all those, spirits and energies, why should you demonize them as well? Because these are indigenous interpretations of the divine. So who decides what is wrong and who decides what is right? These are just food for thought. Answer that question yourself.
So during my undergrad, I took an anthropology class, and this one day our professor asked us a very interesting question. He said, "Why do you think Europe colonized Africa? Why didn't Africa colonize Europe?" And I remember thinking, that's a very interesting question. I don't know if I've ever thought about it in that very way before. And I remember thinking that I'm not sure if I know what the correct answer to this question is, but I feel as though I can probably figure out what some of the clearly wrong answers might be. And one of my classmates gave her answer. She suggested that, well, this is because there is something kind of inherently evil about Europeans. And I figured, all right, well, that's probably a clear example of a wrong answer to this question. I don't believe that any culture or any race has a monopoly on evil. But in class that day, I thought about the question for a little bit and I came up with an answer. I suggested that it probably happened because European nations had reasons to colonize and African nations did not. And part of the reason I thought this made sense was the fact that during my undergrad I also spent a decent amount of time studying modern European history. If I were to sum up modern European history in one sentence, I would say for the most part it was a phallus measuring contest between all of the countries in Europe. My modern European history professor would always say that European nations were constantly trying to keep the balance of power in check. They didn't want any other country to have a hegemony in the continent. And so in order to keep this balance of power, everyone was constantly at war with everybody else. And naturally, a lot of technological advancements happen in wartime. And so at some point, European nations realized that they could get more resources by doing colonialism, and so that became the measure of a giant phallus, having many colonies. And so in order to make sure that the balance of power remained as it was, and nobody was one-upping anybody else, they all went out to go get their colonies. And so as I thought back then, there are different reasons why colonialism happened. Some were fairly mundane, some were accidents of history, some just happened to be the geography of certain countries, some were intentional acts of malice and evil and racism on the parts of some Europeans. But there were all these different reasons. Now, why am I talking about this? That's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. Because this comment is very interesting to me. And I'm particularly interested in what it means to say that all these other cultures were significantly more developed than Africa. What does significantly more developed mean? Who decides when something is developed? And what does it mean to say in a blanket sense that one culture is more developed than another? It is often remarked that when many Europeans first started interacting with Africans, their takeaways were that Africans had no religion, or Africans had no God, or Africans practiced some sort of paganism or animism. And it's often argued that this was as a result of a fundamental misunderstanding of how religions functioned in the African societies that Europeans interacted with. So let's say we're trying to determine what makes a culture more developed than another one, and we look in one place and we see a giant basilica or a cathedral that took hundreds of years to build and is a beautiful display of art and architecture. And this giant building is made as a place of worship to God. But in a different community, you can find their gods in small, very humble-looking shrines. Now, it can be easy to declare that the first society is obviously more developed than the second one because one has a giant building for God, the other just has a very lowly looking shrine. But we can't come to this conclusion. Instead, we have to ask ourselves, what does God mean to these different people? And what are their reasons for building these places of worship? Cathedrals and basilicas are gorgeous pieces of architecture, and they are built to be so big in part because the idea is that you are meant to feel small in the presence of God. And they reach high up into the sky so they can reach God who is up in the sky. But in many societies in Africa, this is not what God is. God is not this giant thing in the sky that is supposed to make you feel small. For example, in societies where people pray and worship their ancestors, ancestors were people who were once alive that you buried in the ground, and now they are essentially like deities. So even if they are more powerful than you, even if they are bigger than you spiritually, they were people who you put in the ground. There is a reference to the ground. And so if your shrine is indistinguishable from a person's house, that is understandable, because your ancestors, when they were alive, lived in houses. And so for people groups who believe this about God, there is no reason to build cathedrals or basilicas. If you don't believe that your God needs this, then why build it? And of course, because there's a lot of diversity across the African continent, if you want to find a people group that thought that it would be important to build giant structures for cultural or religious reasons, you can find that as well. The most obvious example would be the pyramids. You find plenty in Egypt, you find even more in Sudan. But I think conversations like this need to be seen within the context of reasons. You also see conversations like this somewhat come up when talking about art. For example, look at these two sculptures. It can be easy to determine that this one is primitive because this doesn't look like an actual person. And obviously this one is more advanced because it's more photorealistic. But once more, we need to talk about the reasons why these two things were created, and we need to talk about what beauty looks like in these different cultures. It makes sense to think that if a culture does not care about photorealism as a standard for beauty, then their artists, at least initially, will not make photorealistic pieces of art. I think that racism enters this conversation when people start to suggest that the reasons why Africans did not build cathedrals was because they simply could not. There's something about the state of being an African that stops you from thinking of something like a cathedral. And obviously this is false. This is a piece of bronze art from Yoruba land, and there are Yoruba artists today who do hyper-realistic paintings as good as anybody else. This becomes a problem when people try to exclude Africans from common humanity, because in the world of being human, the idea is that if a culture, if a people group have a reason to believe that they need to do something, they're probably going to do it. If they believe that they need to build a cathedral for their god, they're going to do it. If they believe that they need to build a pyramid for their people, they are going to do that as well. If they believe that their god just needs a simple shrine, that's what they're going to do too. And oftentimes when you approach these issues while thinking about the reasons why people do things, a lot of these structures tend to fall apart and you find the arbitrariness of everything. For example, as I mentioned, a lot of Europeans believe that Africans were practicing fetish religions. And a fetish priest is somebody who speaks to spirits on behalf of people. And when African people groups do this, it's considered pagan, it's considered animist, it's considered witchcraft. But the Greeks had an oracle at Delphi that told them the future. How is that any different? Part of this also came from some Europeans believing that there is a natural way to worship. And so standing still in a cathedral while men in robes walk up and down the aisles chanting things in Latin while waving around little thingies, having smoke fill the room, that makes perfect sense. But if people somewhere want to, for example, dance around a fire, that's ridiculous. That's the wrong way to worship. But again, according to who? And of course, when other cultures make pieces of art that are more abstract, that is seen as primitive, but when Picasso does it, it's seen as an act of genius. And so who decides the standard for beauty? Who decides what the right way to worship is? Who decides what it means for a culture to be developed? These are important questions, at least I think so. Now, the theory that I came up with during my undergrad as to why I think Europeans probably colonized Africa and it didn't happen the other way around is, well, something that I thought of. I don't know if it's actually true or if it makes sense. So the people who research these things for a living, let me know if this theory holds any water. But in either case, these are my thoughts. Also, there's something I forgot to say. I think one critique that can be brought against this video is that I'm acting as though we have no idea what development means. And as a Nigerian, yes, I am aware of the fact that we have bad roads. I'm aware of the fact that we do not have constant electricity. I'm aware of the fact that many people don't have access to clean running water. So that is a thing. However, that's not exactly what I'm addressing in this video. I think it's one thing to say that Nigeria, like many nations today, are not as developed as other ones. It's another thing to say that Africa, since the dawn of time, has been underdeveloped compared to everywhere else in the world. The first point deals with economics and development studies and post-colonial theory. The latter certainly deals with different things, but philosophy is one of them. Because the idea that Africa is by its nature an underdeveloped place is a philosophical one. See Hegel. Yes, this video addresses the idea that Africa has always been underdeveloped compared to everywhere else.